Good afternoon. My name is Mphele Yelane, Economic Analyst and Managing Director of Ezamazwe Education Center for Innovation based in South Africa, Limpopo Province. I present to you a research paper titled Advancing Sustainable Rural Education through ICT. Transformation in education is occurring throughout the world, and one of the ideologies of this transformation is the introduction and integration of ICT in the education system. This is why integration of ICT to rural education, especially here in South Africa, is more critical today than ever before, because it amplifies the need as a driving force to economic, social, and education reforms. Most importantly, it reduces the imbalance of the past, leading to a new era. The impact of ICT in education systems cannot be overemphasized. Its effectiveness is changing the way students learn, teachers teach, and support staff work. Integration of ICT in the South African schools has gained momentum in recent years, with ICT fully integrated in many, if not all, schools in urban areas in South Africa. Regrettably, the same cannot be said about the rural schools. This has created digital divide that is a learning gap between rural and urban schools. The presented paper is informed by such a disparity. The existing literature was observed to make the case for ICT in South Africa's rural schools context. The same approach is used to identify key challenges disturbing the smooth introduction of ICT into all South African schools, including the rural schools. Therefore, the aim is to bridge the gap between the rural schools and the urban schools when it comes to education. Introduction. Education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. When the former President Nelson Mandela said these words at Madison Park High School in 1990, these words were used to inspire change in education of a black child who generally resides in rural areas of the country. The right to basic education is pinned in Section 29 of the South African Constitution, which states, "Everyone has a right to basic education." The Constitutional Court has therefore held that the right to basic education imposes a positive obligation on the state to provide and make basic education available to everyone, including those in rural communities. The inclusion of socio-economic rights in the South African Constitution envisioned the reconstruction and transformation of a divided and unequal society, which is why the Department of Basic Education introduced integration of ICT into the schools as a way of providing quality education and making education accessible to everyone. Unfortunately, 78% of grade 4 learners in South Africa cannot read. In other words, 8 out of every 10 9-year-olds in South Africa is currently functionally illiterate. Simply put, this is the most urgent wake-up call to our country to see how and where the future of this country looks like. We need to respond accordingly. A 78% illiteracy rate in grade 4 means the next generation will enter the workforce without basic education skills needed to raise themselves out of poverty. It means a generation without capacity to learn, to read, and to lead. At present, integrating ICT into education is considered as a vital means to promote new method of teaching and learning. Countries, particularly developing ones in Africa, cannot afford to stay passive to ICT if they are to compete and strive in the global economy. Globally, ICT drives employability. It makes absolute sense to spare no effort in integrating ICT into rural schools so that rural learners become equally employable just like the rest of the world do. Besides, ICT for all schools will be in the long run produce a workforce that is globally competitive. Available literature identifies lack of access to rural schools. lack of electricity, lack of telecommunication infrastructure as key challenges working against smooth introduction of ICT into rural schools in South Africa. The infrastructure challenge in rural areas are a direct result of the apartheid policy of segregation and separate development. Although such strides have been made since democracy in 1994, it is evident that it will take some time before rural areas of South Africa too have access to sufficient infrastructure needed to make ICT integration into schools much easier. Secondly, in the face of ICT skills shortage in South Africa, it will be unreasonable to expect rural schools not to face ICT support problems. It is important to consider that since democracy, rural schools are receiving attention as far as electricity, telecommunication, and rural network is concerned. The cost of installing ICT in rural areas can be expected to be even higher, mainly due to transportation costs and other logistical costs. It is only natural that costs be a problem for integration of ICT in rural schools in South Africa. Motivation. Drawing on the work already done in ICT and sustainable rural education, we aim to explore perceived ICT initiatives in education sector. With purposes to help bridge the apparent digital divide between rural and urban schools in South Africa. The challenge or the problem area through this research was a lack of reliable comparative data and lack of understanding from participants on what ICT generally meant. The project intends to achieve two objectives: to explain why is it essential for South African schools, no matter where they are located, to integrate ICT into their day-to-day administration and teaching and learning processes. And secondly, it sought to identify suitable ICT solution for rural schools in South Africa, to be precise. Choosing one research approach over the other severely limits the scope of the study. In order to facilitate a more comprehensive study, we employed both inductive and deductive approach for data analysis as a research tool. Qualitative data was used to derive concepts and models, while quantitative research was observed to make a connection between what is known and what can be learned. Research methodology included data collection, an existing literature study approach. Quantitative data was analyzed using descriptive statistics to show the frequency of the period it took for the rural schools to adopt to the full integration during our project. And secondary data offered rich understanding of what is already done by the government. During our survey, we collected data from the schools, which the questionnaires were completed by the principals, the teachers, and the parents. On the primary stage, schools were stratified and selected with the probability according to their size. Plans for replacement schools were identified in advance in case the schools refused to take part. In the secondary stage, classes were randomly selected within the sampled schools, and the students in the selected classes were surveyed. Classes were strategically selected with equal probability within the school. During our implementation process, a team leader in each community was asked to nominate a coordinator and provide access to the most recent version of our official school database. Samples of schools and replacement were randomly selected in each community for each grade. Administration process. The 3 survey questionnaires were translated into their home language for the participating communities and made available to respondents in their appropriate language. Data analysis. After data cleaning, translated, and weighing on non-respondents adjustments, data was processed and standard error calculated. Some of the items in the questionnaires were designed to be used in analysis as single items like gender, but most were designed to be combined in some ways in order to measure underlying construct that could not be observed directly. The survey findings were based on 250 questionnaires that were answered by students, 50 from teachers, and 200 from parents between March and April 2021. According to the survey results, at least 91% of students in rural communities are highly digitally equipped to access learning material on their mobile, access free educational applications, and online tutorial videos from YouTube. From the parents, the findings reveals that most have been familiar with ICT at home, but still to a limited extent. Digital resources such as exercise software, online tutorial and quizzes, data logging, digital apps stimulate learning experience. Students started being independent and access information really easy. Learners got hooked to finding information, which is what we realized after when we were closing off the project, that the learners were starting to be more interested in finding their own work, being independent, self-reliant on finding information. And teachers gave a feedback that the system now, or ICT access, makes learners engage during lessons and encourage discussions on different topics, while the parents' responses were the students now are finding it easy to find information with a click without a hassle, and students are well informed in the stream of their study due to access to the internet or even the learning applications that they received on their phones. In conclusion, it is safe to say that South Africa has done a lot to advance sustainable rural education. Integration will sharpen students' independent thinking skills. With ICT integration in rural classrooms, students will be able to engage in interactive tasks with wider range of up-to-date information and knowledge to achieve the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development Goal, especially number 4, ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. Schools should be flexible to accept the use of parent-sponsored smartphones during lessons. 91% of learners in rural schools have access to smartphones, actively engaging on social media platforms. So best they accepted to use them in school.